In episode 6, Juliet used that bait. She planted the Pez dispenser in Doug's apartment so that when her, Paul, and a couple other deputies went to search his apartment, they would find it. She allowed Paul to find it. That would hopefully open up an investigation that she could dig into and look into why George was murdered. The next day, though, when Paul shows up for work, he's surprised because Juliet still has the Pez dispenser in her property, and she's supposed to take it to judicial. In fact, it's against the pact that she's kept it this long. They start arguing about the pact because Juliet has done some research. She's actually been reading up on it. What the pact says is she's allowed to keep the relic if it's involved in a serious crime. And she feels like murder is a serious crime. The relic being found there is interesting. But Paul points out that yes, the sheriff can keep the relic as long as judicial signs off on it. That means later that day, Paul and Rebecca head to judicial. They meet with both Sims and the judge. Juliet shows both of them what they located in Doug's apartment, and that comes as a big surprise to Sims. Sims is definitely suspicious, but Juliet asks the judge's permission to look into it, because nobody in the room knows exactly what this relic is. They just know that it is a relic. Before the judge can even answer, Sims starts arguing with Juliet about the fact that this relic did not belong to Doug. He knows this because Judicial has all the relics cataloged in a database that is way more advanced than the one that the sheriff would have knowledge of. Sims does point out that what Judicial does know is the watch that Juliet is wearing once belonged to George Wilkins, the guy that she claims is murdered. She doesn't deny it, but it does leave Sims pretty suspicious. And even though he's suspicious, he still thinks that an investigation into the relic would be a smart play, especially considering they're having a forgiveness day. It could open up more relics being turned in. Once Juliet and Paul leave, Juliet tries to get rid of Paul, telling him, yeah, kick rocks, I'll see you in an hour. But Paul says, that's not going to happen. Now that Sims is giving you permission to do this, he's going to have eyes on you at all times. He's trying to pin you on something. So, like it or not, I'm with you today. Reluctantly, Juliet agrees, and the first place they head to is Patrick's. She asks Patrick if he knows who deals with relics, and he claims dumb. He's reluctant to tell her anything, especially considering Paul is with her, and he doesn't know Paul. Eventually, though, he does give up a name. Her name is Regina Jackson, and when Juliet and Paul get there, she's not the most welcoming, especially considering it has to do with George. She recognizes the watch on Juliet's arm, and she tells Juliet, I used to be his girlfriend. And that stops Juliet right in her tracks, because she thought that George was hers, and hers alone. And now she's finding out that George was double-dipping a little bit. And from the way that Regina tells it, Regina wasn't a big fan of George, because she feels like George used her to get what he wanted, i.e. relics, and then he moved on to the next thing, i.e. Juliet. Regina tells both of them that she's not a relics dealer. George just had her buy things for him. Other than that, after George went down to mechanicals, she never heard from him again, so she can't really help out. Right before they leave, Juliet asks Regina, do you have any questions for us? And Regina says, yeah. When he told you that he loved you, did you believe him? And Juliet doesn't even dignify it with a response. She just walks out, but you can tell she's troubled. Now, while those two were investigating, Sims was doing an investigation of his own. He went to those judicial archives, and he looked into the Pez dispenser, and sure enough, it's in there. It's even registered to a George Wilkins, which Sims finds really interesting. The fact that Juliet is wearing a watch that they know was George's. The fact that they know that Juliet claimed George was murdered, and the fact that now Doug just so happened to have an item that was also known to be from George. It's all too much of a coincidence for Sims. So Sims, along with Bernard, head down to visit Juliet in her office. And Juliet's taken completely off guard when Sims tells her that Judicial knows that the relic belonged to George. But when they searched George's apartment, they didn't find it. Now, mysteriously, it turns up in Doug's apartment. And they know it never belonged to Doug. So for Judicial, it's all too much of a coincidence that Juliet is wearing the watch of a dead guy she claims was murdered, and now the dead guy's relic turns up in Doug's apartment. Juliet, thinking on her feet, points out that it was actually Paul who found the relic in the first place, not her. And Paul doesn't say a word, although he knows that he was being used. Juliet, though, does get a lifeline when Bernard asks Sims, hey, is it possible that Doug was one of the people that searched George's apartment? If he was, then it's very possible he saw the relic, he thought it was cool, and he just kept it, never turning it in. Sims doesn't believe it, but he also can't argue with it. Bernard then asks Juliet if, in her search, they found any reason of why Trumbull would want to kill Marnes and the mayor. But Juliet says, no, not yet. Bernard is cool, though, if this remains unsolved. When Bernard and Sims eventually leave, Paul confronts Juliet about why she would plant the item in Doug's apartment and then put him in a situation where he's the one to find it. He's really pissed off about this because her actions could have gotten him jailed or, even worse, sent out to clean. And he's got a family. He's got a daughter. He screams at her that she has to start being honest with him. Not just as if her life depended on it, but his as well. Juliet's kind of dismissive of it and tries to walk away, but Paul keeps harping on it until finally Juliet says, okay, if you want to be honest, your hand shakes. You've been hiding it. You have the syndrome and you haven't reported that. And isn't that a part of the pact? And according to the pact, because you have the syndrome, you are completely unqualified to have this job. You shouldn't be anywhere near a firearm. Paul doesn't deny it. He just wants honesty from Juliet. And she doesn't seem willing to give it. So finally, he just goes home. Juliet heads home a little while later, and as she's going to her apartment, she once again sees Lucas in the cafeteria by himself. The stars aren't out, so she's a little curious as to why Lucas is even there, and he says it's because he was waiting to see her. There's heavy flirtation going on. When Juliet eventually gets to her apartment, she can't sleep. The thought about George cheating on her is just too much. She needs some advice, and she radios Martha. She's ready to give up. She's ready to give up the badge, because the whole reason she showed up and took the job was to find out who killed George. But George turned out to be a lying cheat. And she doesn't care anymore who killed him. She just feels betrayed. Martha, though, convinces her to stick with it. She gives her a little bit of a pep talk, reminding her that it speaks volumes if Juliet were to give up all because she found out some unsettling news about George. After this little pep talk, Juliet is remotivated and she decides to go visit Regina again, this time without Paul. She confronts Regina saying, "You're the rat who gave up George to Judicial. You told them about the hard drive. It's because of you that George is dead. You talked to them." And Regina says, No, it's not Judicial I talked to. No, Judicial comes during the day. They ask the easy questions. But the man who knows everything, he comes at night. He was standing at the foot of my bed. He repeated every single person I talked to that day. This shocks Juliet, but before she can ask any questions, Regina starts putting on a fan to drown out any noise that were to take place because she tells Juliet they can hear us. Once there is noise drowning out their conversation, Juliet asks her, "Who are you talking about?" But Regina never answers, just telling Juliet that every name that Regina gave this person was another day her mom didn't have to spend in the mines. So yeah, she gave up quite a few names. Juliet asks Regina what was on the hard drive, but Regina tells her, "I have no idea. I never saw it." She traded George the hard drive for something that she's kept, and it's incredible. She walks over to her rug, and it was hidden inside. It's a book. The book's been passed down for generations in George's family. And when Regina hands it over, she tells Juliet, "This will get you killed." When Juliet gets back to her apartment and looks at it, she realizes why. The book is a Georgia travel guide from pre-rebellion. It's a kid's book with a bunch of pictures. Visuals that shock Juliet because it's colors and shapes and trees and rivers, stuff she has never seen. Stuff that shows shocking, she's having trouble processing it. But what Juliet doesn't know is that Judicial is watching her read this book. Because Judicial has a hidden camera in Juliet's apartment. And the two agents that are watching this decide that they have to wake up Sims. He has to see this. Thank you so much for checking out this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel and subscribing to my Patreon. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. If you left a comment, I don't get back to you. I usually don't check the comments unless they're like a super comment. Also, if you don't see the next video up on the end screen, not to worry, it'll be up in a day or two.